Hey, you.
Hey, I'm Zannerman.
I'm not interested in who you are.
This isn't exactly my regular type of video, and not really the type of video I want to make going forward, but I am a fan of Gothic, and seeing that there is a remake for the first Gothic being made, I want to air some thoughts I had while watching the footage from Gamescom. And some things will be easier to show in a video format, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, a developer would take feedback into account, and perhaps more realistically, provide entertainment for those that are interested in game design and analysis. I want to say up front, I'm not a Gothic 1 purist that gets mad at every deviation from the original. I want the remake to be as successful as possible, because I am a huge fan, and I want other people to be as inspired by the Gothic series as I have been. With that out of the way, let's get to the demo. With Gamescom, we got to watch streamers play a demo of the remake, but it is set in a contained section at the start of the game, with a self-contained story and a different protagonist, so keep that in mind. That also means that there isn't much to analyze regarding the narrative, so I will be focusing on systems and how it looks. Let's start off with the visuals. From what we can see in the demo, it looks great, at least in my opinion. I like the level design, sticking so close to the original, while expanding on what was there with new areas, such as the abandoned mine and the forest above it. They've clearly made efforts to stay faithful to the original. The extra details on the mountains adds a lot to the feel of the Valley of Mines. It gives it a more tropical impression than I had before. Even if the valley isn't tropical, that is the initial impression I get. The water looks nice as far as I can tell. However, stepping into the water doesn't really have great feedback. There are some basic effects like rippling and waving behind the character as they swim, but it doesn't seem like the character is in a liquid, more just floating through a plane because of it. The swimming animation also has the character's face first in the water as they swim. Sure, arm crawlers in real life can do this too, but they do need to breathe occasionally. I don't know any easy or simple changes to help with this. Maybe increase the rippling effect around the character, add splashes to jumping into the water, or add a wave on the water in front of the character. That might be unrealistically exaggerated, but it is a satisfying effect in games such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, as it felt like you were physically displacing the water when you were moving in it. The waterfall here could also cause a larger rippling throughout the pond. And when you dive down, I think the underwater looks really good. I like the subtle switch from arm crawling to breaststroke as the character dives. But even here, the effects aren't very noticeable. It could use some additional bubbles forming behind the character as they dive through the water. One thing I'm not a huge fan of is the darkness of the shadows. Now, it could be due to the streamed video or YouTube compression that makes it seem like a bigger deal, but I'll talk about it regardless. It makes for poor readability of the landscape and potential dangers. Light and darkness can be a really nice mechanic for players to overcome with torches or lanterns, but this is outside, at daytime, not a place that should require the player to bring their own light source. Even if they did, eye adaptation would probably make it hard to see in the shadows anyway. You can see eye adaptation at work in this clip. As the player gets close to the shadowed forest, it lights up. I also noticed some eye adaptation when entering the mine as well, but it still isn't enough to make things clear inside without a light source. Now that's fine for a mine, as it should be very dark, but it makes the entrance when viewed from the outside super dark. During conversations, you can really appreciate all the detail that has gone into the characters. I think the intimate conversation camera gives the characters you talk to a sense of importance and place in the world. It's something I've observed, that the further a camera is and the faster the movement, the more you become detached from the world and characters. There are, of course, exceptions that offset this, but that's only a general observation. That said, while the depth of field blur might help keep the eye fixated on the character you are talking to, I don't think it's necessary. It could look good without it. Of course, I haven't seen what it looks like without the DOF. It could look like shit. Only the developers could answer that. Sometimes the camera placement in conversations is awkward, but you can see that in almost every RPG with this style of conversation camera. And given that the camera switches often enough, it isn't too bad. Still, it could be something to adjust for the full release. I also want to mention that conversations get you stuck in place, and you can't respond to the events of the world. There didn't seem to be an obvious way for Lollipop G to exit the conversation once she was being attacked by a scavenger. Kai Rosenkrantz, who worked on the original soundtrack, is back to compose the soundtrack for the remake, and I think he's doing a really good job at remastering old tracks. Voice acting also seems great. A variety of different accents were featured, and that adds a lot of personality to the characters and makes the valley feel like a mix of people from various walks of life, and I hope they keep it up. Some of the creature sounds appear to be missing or bugged. There is, for instance, silent screeching from the scavengers. And very little noise from the goblin.
Oh no, the game's broken.
In general, the mole rats and scavengers are very passive. They don't give off those warning sounds and eye you warily that they do in the original game here in the demo. Instead, the mole rat ignores the player in this instance. And the scavenger should clearly have noticed the player, but it turns around when he approaches. The execution sounds don't sound very satisfyingly brutal at all. And I'll talk a bit more about the combat sounds in the combat section as it ties into combat feedback. But overall, I think the soundscape is fine. I do find it hard to judge due to not having experienced the demo myself. I do like the return of the death screech from the original. There are some signs that the audio is still unrefined. I noticed that the forest sounds were playing inside the mine area, for instance, and it didn't have its own ambient soundscape. But then, later, you can only hear the mine ambience. And here in this example, you can hear them both at the same time, as they overlap. From what I can tell, the animations of the demo could use a lot of refinement. My primary complaint is that they are too cumbersome and slow. They could really be sped up a lot, especially for the beginning of most animations, which could give a better sense of responsiveness. Anything that is out of combat could really stand to be a lot quicker, or the player at least, such as interacting with chairs, or the frying pan. As for the movement, there was some strangeness with turning that left the legs behind, and movement in general looks slightly cumbersome. The character doesn't seem to stop immediately and takes a moment before they enter the running animation. The looting of the body animation appears to remove control from the player, and it is very slow. I get that they're going for a slower game, like Red Dead Redemption 2, but this is an animation that will play hundreds of times. It really needs to be a lot quicker. Inventory of what you are looking to loot should pop up immediately, and the animation could play as you check through it. Then once the player is done, transition to the standing up animation, if you want to keep this animation at all. Another point against this is if you initiate a looting animation and an enemy ambushes you while you get locked into the animation, you are almost guaranteed to die, because there doesn't appear to be an obvious way to cancel out of the animation. When picking up the torch from the ground, it plays the unsheath animation for things that are on his back, when he should kneel down and pick it up from the ground, or at least swipe towards the ground. Tossing the torch down into the ground so that it sticks up is a weird move. I would prefer it if it was laying down on the ground, but I could understand that real-time shadows and bumps in the terrain could make it far less useful for illumination that way, but I think it looks a bit silly in its current state. I'm also not sure why this white flash appears when you toss the torch into the ground, and when holding a torch, which I consider an exploration activity, you are considered in combat and have the combat keybinds.
But if I pick this up, am I in combat again? And now I'm in combat.
Valve, please fix.
Ladders also seem janky. You have to stop, then highlight it, and then press F. It is a cumbersome process. One streamer I watched never even got the pop-up for interacting with the ladder, and so they assumed they couldn't climb ladders at all. stomping meat bugs takes away control as well. It lines up the animation, then executes. Here you can see that the first time even misses the stomp. I can see that this could be a point of frustration. And that's another thing that seems to be prevalent throughout the demo, is that the player loses control for many of these animations. And even in events, such as when you initiate a duel with Kurgo. I hope they reevaluate how much they take away player control during these animations. Now let's talk about the combat. There's a fair amount I have to say, and not all of it good. Well, I'll mostly focus on what I see as issues, since the video will be long enough already. Carnage spoke about the controls of the combat, and the breakdown, as I understand it, is the following. When you draw your weapon, you enter into a combat state, much like the original. On the controller, your keybinds change into combat ones. There are 4 different attacks you can initiate, with 4 different buttons. You have right swing, left swing, overhead and straight attacks, or stabs. You also have a dodge and a block. I would like to echo Carnage's suggestion to have the option to initiate overheads and stabs through scrolling the mouse wheel, like they are handled in the Chivalry games. It may seem unintuitive at first, but it handles very well in Chivalry. We see 2 different skill levels for one-handed users in the remake, unskilled and trained levels. In the original there were 3 levels in total, and the 3rd level was called Master Level. Gry TV PL showcased some combos on the 2nd tier of fighting during his stream. I feel like the movements are fairly exaggerated. This is supposed to be a tier 2 of training, so the hero should have the training of a fighter at this point. Then this is the moveset we will see for much of the game, at least throughout the early to mid-game. Some of these combos appear to be faster to execute than others. The overhead finisher is slow, while the stabs come out much quicker. There is also a lot of forward momentum on these combos. I haven't played it, so I don't know if it's a matter of input, but if this is the standard attack pattern, I assume fighting anywhere near ledges is going to be a lesson in frustration. In practice, the attack combo has a flaw. The knockback on the first attack pushes the enemy back, which makes the follow-up swing always miss. This appears to be consistent behavior.
Ooh, damn.
You can also hit through multiple creatures, or at least stagger them together. There appears to be some clunkiness with the dodging, or at least how the player intuitively wants dodging to work, versus how dodging actually works, where the player wants to dodge away from the enemy here, and the character interprets this as a forward dodge backwards, turning the character's back towards the enemy. But here in this example, we see dodges as they are supposed to work. I'm not sure if this is a matter of unfamiliarity with the controls, or if the input scheme for dodging is somehow unintuitive. Maybe it is a case of expecting Elden Ring or Assassin's Creed dodge controls, where you input the dodge button and the direction you want to dodge in at the same time. It's hard to tell without playing for myself. There might be invulnerability frames. It looks fairly smooth when Ko is fighting Ratford in this clip. However, scavengers seem a bit tricky to dodge. He dodges the scavenger here, but still gets hit, perhaps due to the forward momentum of the scavenger's attack. It seems like you can dodge out of an attack during the wind-up of the attack, so there is some possible reactivity to the enemy. The enemy might have iframes here during their dodge, and it is possible only a part of the dodge has iframes, as we see here. But it also looks like the weapon didn't connect at all, so it's possible there are no iframes. I didn't see too many uses of blocking in the video I watched, Ko managed to successfully block against the scavenger, and it seemed like he interrupted the scavenger's attack with a block twice. I say interrupted because there wasn't much of a sound or visual feedback that this had happened. If that is intended behavior, it really should have some feedback to visualize it. I like the change that you can block animals now, and while that made fighting beasts feel very different from fighting humans, it took away one combat option during half your battles. This streamlines the system a bit. We saw some ranged combat too. The longer you hold down the bow and aim, the higher the damage, as you can see here. There should be a confirmation sound for hitting things far away. While unrealistic, it helps ranged combat feel a lot better. The scavengers do not react to their compatriots being killed by Drax. But they do aggro if it is the player shooting. I do like Drax's bow animation. But the ranged combat does bring up my next point. The movement speed and reactivity of the enemies feels rather slow, which, if left the same, would make ranged combat very strong. It's already less of a risk than melee combat. What I mean by slow is that the AI is downright broken at times. It doesn't have that warn if the player gets close behavior, and outright ignores the player when they get close. They are also passive and hardly react. Some examples. When I think of enemies in Gothic, I think of consistency of behavior. In that regard, they are like the enemies in Dark Souls, where they have clear attack patterns and behaviors. If you were far away, the scavenger would do a charge attack, that if you strafed to the side, it was easily punishable. While fights against human opponents was more of a Sekiro style of parry through their combo, and then get a window to punish, before you return to parrying. Given the state of the AI in the demo, I find it hard to judge whether that will be true for the remake. I hope it is. I did notice when launching up the original that the juvenile variants at the start were very passive and had limited movesets, but the remake demo did not classify the ones in the demo as juvenile variants. Last part of combat I would like to talk about is the feedback and sounds. Now, what we do have in terms of feedback, there seems to be a screen shake and a blur as hits land, sometimes. But this doesn't always happen. I'm not sure if this is intended, or a microstutter. There's also a knockback on some hits, a blood decal effect, a hit sound, and the enemy reacts with noise. And when you kill something, it ragdolls in a satisfying manner. I think the sounds could use a meteor impact for strikes.
Oh no! Oh god!
You had your warning.
It's more of a thud when you hit something right now, rather than the sound of cutting through meat. My complaint is that the sound doesn't match the visuals of the blood effect at all. You could also angle the blood effect to the direction of the swing. Another effect that could be added is a subtle hit stop added to weapon swings as they hit an enemy. Some games go overboard with this effect, but it does feel better and adds some physicality to the attacks. And maybe some jitter and morphing of the model as it gets hit. Shouldn't change any combat timings, just purely visual. The current UI reminds me a lot of Skyrim, with the white borders and Nordic reminiscent patterning. I have no idea what these boxes on everything are meant to invoke. I don't know if the arrows to either side of the UI are meant to indicate that you can switch pages by going left and right, but the tabs at the top already do that. Because of the slanted ends and beginnings of the health bar, it makes it a bit less readable when at almost max and almost depleted. The highlighting is a good touch. Makes it easier to see at a glance how much health you have. Around items you can interact with, there is a white outline. I'm not a big fan of this design for a few reasons. 1. It looks intrusive. I get that the current UI design is all white and silver, but it does take you out of the world. 2. It hinders engagement with the world. The first two Gothics have the benefit of being on old graphical engines, where there isn't as much world detail and clutter, and you learned quickly to notice which items and herbs you could interact with. Skyrim is a slightly more recent example, in that it has more world clutter to obfuscate which objects are interactable with. Even there, you learn quickly which plants are harvestable from appearance alone, and which objects you can pick up. And once you learn, you can spot these items pretty easily, and you start to look at your environment in way more detail. I get that it is a modern sensibility to have everything interactable highlighted, but I'm not a huge fan. I think there are better ways to do it if you're making an in-depth RPG. Minor personal nitpick, but I would like for the name of the creature you loot to remain as text, instead of being replaced with an icon. Same with items you pick up. I would rather have the name on screen than just the icon. I would like to see a current and max health indicator on the stats screen, and same for mana. The readability of equipments with stats could use some improvement as well. It was unclear which stats were the item and which were for your currently equipped item. And learning points seem to have been renamed to skill points, and I don't mind that change at all. Conclusion. Obviously, I doubt they would have the budget to give it AAA refinement on everything from graphics to animations. I feel the game would benefit from a pass looking at the user experience. From experience, I can also know how much getting feedback can mean, if nothing else, than to point out pain points to the developers. And while I'm only a gamer, I hope I've provided some value to the discourse. The more I've watched of the demo and read up on information about it from Gamescom, the more hopeful I am that the end product will be good and faithful to the original. However, I really hope that the game, and particularly the combat aspects, being the most important pillar of the game, gets the polish that it needs. Finally, the remake is set to release probably sometime next year. Dragon Age The Veilguard releases in October of 2024. Avowed is set to release in February of 2025. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is also set to release in February of 2025, and Crimson Desert sometime in Q2 of 2025. The spring and winter is going to be dominated by those big RPG titles, each of which I think currently has a bigger presence in the general awareness of gamers than Gothic Remake. They might be able to carve out the space for themselves in the online discourse, but I don't think THQ can compete when it comes to marketing against those essentially AAA titles. I really hope that the remake reaches a more general awareness among gamers. That's all I had to say. Thanks for listening.